from the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America. This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Authentic conversations with leaders in the biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel industries.
Farmers have heard about sustainability for a number of years, and then regenerative ag has been kind of a newer term. But carbon intensity really in production agriculture has not been a term that has been used a lot until very recently.
This is Sharon Bard, principal at Terra Economics. And this week, she joins Clean Fuels Director of Environmental Science, Veronica Bradley, as they explore the USDA's efforts to standardize climate-smart agriculture practices across the nation.
Thanks, Scott. Really excited to be with you here today, Sharon Bard. Terra Economics. We spend so much time together that it's funny to think that, we're recording for an audience, getting a little sneak peek of behind the scenes of the day in and day out that we spend staring at each other, normally on a computer screen.
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to be here with you, Veronica, too, because, I'm usually in East Central Illinois in the amongst of soybean and corn fields, and I often are sharing farm stories with you, virtually. And so it's great to be here. And as I said, as you said, talk about, climate smart ag and why it's important to everyone across the supply chain.
Yeah. You've done so much in helping me learn about agriculture, right? I tout, I'm a city girl and I'm the typical person who doesn't know where food comes from. And, it's been really exciting to join the Clean Fuels family and learn about the intricacies of agriculture and the role that we can play. And so I'm really excited to dive into climate smart ag, having my kind of roots in climate change and science and, environmentalism. So
yeah.
I think where I'd love to start is just kind of explaining what climate smart ag is, because I think from what I can tell, it's kind of a newer term. Mm-hmm. We've heard about regenerative agriculture or sustainable practices, but now the conversation's around climate smart. So can you explain a little bit, maybe the origin, or if there are any real determinants of what climate smart ag means?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I think that, there's been lots of organizations that have attempted to, that have defined climate smart agriculture. And I know that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, in addition to the World Bank, have really explicitly defined climate smart by identifying basically three different priorities for climate smart agriculture. And one of them is to sustainably increase agricultural productivity and income. And then another pillar of that definition is to adapt or to build resilience to climate change. And then the third pillar that they've defined regarding climate smart ag is to reduce and or remove greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's a definition that has been adopted globally. And I think that it has been really the focus of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the last few years. And it's something that they've really wanted to bring to the producers, because they see that as an opportunity for the producers to not only be part of the solution to climate change, but also to create market opportunities for those that are in the fields that are producing corn and soybeans and, being part of this wonderful agricultural system that we have in this country.
Yeah, I think it's really, to me, that's really helpful to have parameters around it, because I think when I started, people were talking about climate smart ag, but then half of it was like, well, what is it really?
Right.
And, for clean fuels part, right, we're very focused on those greenhouse gas emissions. The carbon intensity score relates to, what goes into, what are the emissions that come out of production, and knowing that, there's more to it than that, right? And I've spent my career, before Clean Fuels and everything, on climate mitigation. So how do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions when there's a whole world of adaptation that comes to that resiliency that will be really important for all of us?
Well, farmers have heard about sustainability for a number of years. And then, as you've mentioned, regenerative ag has been kind of a new term or newer term. But carbon intensity really in production agriculture has not been a term that has been used a lot until very recently. And it's something that, now farmers are hearing all about, carbon intensity or CI scores. And there's been a lot of confusion about what that really means and how that impacts them and how they can affect their marketability of their crops.
Yeah.
And so I think that climate smart ag and what the USDA program has done is really forcing the conversation to become clearer to agriculture producers,
Right.
and allowing them to see where their market opportunities are for them, and also to be part of the, as I've already said, the solution.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because I think, I mean, that's such a great perspective, because we've even talked about, reports. What's the carbon intensity of this field, or what's the carbon intensity of a bushel of soybeans? And then, my colleagues will be like, well, what the heck does that even mean for fuel? Because we think in the carbon intensity of the energy product. And so there's even that translation that I think is probably really hard between the feedstock producer, the farmer, and then the fuel producer. You're talking in terms of different units of measurement.
Yeah. I mean, it is very confusing because, as you say, different units of measurement is one component. But then also, if you look at the entire supply chain for fuel, biofuels, if you will, you've got the feedstock, and then you've got the aggregators, all the activities that occur on behalf of the oil seeds beyond the farm gate up to the oil seed crusher, and then to the processor. And, each of those segments generate their own greenhouse gas emissions, and is part of what we call life cycle analysis. And it's something that those that are kind of more upstream in terms of the supply chain, they've been thinking about it for years, whereas production agriculture, that's a relatively new concept to them.
Yeah. And do you think part of that is when we think about the different renewable fuel programs that we have traditionally today, right? We've got EPA's renewable fuel standard that kind of has a number, and then, okay, well, soybean biodiesel qualifies, so we kind of don't have to worry about that anymore. And then you've got California, which starts to get more interesting with variability and carbon intensity. But the basis for agricultural feedstocks is just kind of national data. It takes an average. And so it's kind of dissociated in a way from an individual farmer. Do you think that plays into kind of not fully processing the role that could be played?
Well, I mean, I think that there are many dimensions to that. So, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture recently released a request for information, and that was to help them really begin articulating what should be going into a standard that then can be used in international and national markets for calculating carbon intensity scores at the field level for feedstocks. And it's a very complex calculation, if you will, that the general public doesn't really think about or understand the complexity. I mean, agriculture is a biological system.
It's super complex.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something that, you just crank up something and something comes out and you can measure it. I mean, there's biology involved. And so with that biology is the fact that cropping systems are very different by different regions in our country. And the United States is very blessed with a very diverse portfolio of resources. And that includes both the soil types, the different topographies, the different climates. And, it's because we're such a large country. And as a result of that, if you calculate a carbon intensity score for one area, for example, in the Northern Plains, compared to the Mississippi Delta or the Southeast or even the Corn Belt, they can be very different because of all these different factors. And so as a result, using a national value really is not appropriate because it doesn't account for those differences and doesn't allow the producers the appropriate credits, if you will, for their production systems.
Yeah, and the potential to change kind of their emissions. And I think, the impression I've gotten about the history of the LCFS in California was we can't go the next step because it's just too complicated, right?
Yeah.
But I think what's really exciting about, as you mentioned, the request for information that USDA put out was they want to try to tackle that.
Yes.
And what I also really thought was interesting about it was, and we can talk about it a little bit, the Inflation Reduction Act that passed in 2022 created some tax incentives for our industry that are carbon intensity based. And a part of that, though, was thinking about climate smart ag and being able to impact carbon intensity all the way up to the producer of the feedstock
And this is the first time
ever someone's considering it. But then they've opened up this can of worms. But then the USDA was like, well, really, it's tax credit. That's Treasury's purview. But we've got this other statutory authority that says, okay, how do we want to think about this from an agricultural perspective? And could be applied to way more than just those tax credits. And frankly, their positioning in that request doesn't mention, the SAF blenders tax credit or 45Z, the clean fuel production credit. It's like in biofuel programs, we could consider how do you quantify, how do you verify, how do you set up a program to consider what's going on actually on the field and the land management that's going on?
Absolutely. I think that USDA viewed this as an opportunity and, recognizing that, as you just said, the 40B SAF tax guidance was really the first time that they are explicitly crediting climate smart practices for these feedstocks. But they, said, well, there are other international programs, there are national programs. We want to create a standard that can be applied across other things beyond the 45Z, clean fuel production credit. And
why do you think USDA wants to do this? And anything about why now? I think about, the Inflation Reduction Act created the Climate Smart Commodities Grant. So USDA is on top of this, right?
Well, I think that the administration has felt very strongly about this, and that's become part of their mission. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's been an increased recognition of climate change and the impact. And I think another issue is also just, farmers are increasingly feeling the impacts of the extreme weather events, whether it's wind, whether it's excessive rain, or whether it's drought. And, these are events that...
There's nothing like being on a call with you and Richard Nelson, shout out to Richard, another farmer, where if I'm late to the call and I come on and it's you're just asking each other, how's the weather? What's going on? Where are you guys? And I'm come on. And I'm ooh, what's the local weather going on over
Exactly.
there?
We always have to have the check-in in terms of what the status is of the weather and the crops conditions and things like that. But yes, no one is suggesting that these events are going to be going away. Yeah. And so it is recognizing that there's going to have to be adaptation in addition to, just being resilient to these weather events. And that is part of the, all of the activities they're all interconnected with climate smart agricultural farming practices. Mm-hmm. And, these are things that are intended to improve soil health, decrease, greenhouse gas emissions, decrease, runoff and leaching of nutrients from the soil, increasing soil organic carbon sequestration. And so these are all things that ultimately they both benefit the environment, they benefit the producers, they decrease, the carbon footprint for the products. And so I think that the administration has just recognized the importance of this and has really made it a priority to them.
Yeah, and I know the little data points that I know are agriculture is 10% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and it kind of always has been, which doesn't mean to say that there hasn't been vast improvement, right? Yields have gone up, things have improved, or the productivity, almost the carbon intensity of the product at even a national level is vastly improved over that time. But it seems that it's kind of this pernicious little sticking point that it's 10%, 10%, no matter what happens, even over with improvements. But one of the things that I think is exciting is being able to kind of potentially tackle in a way and incentivize reductions in agricultural emissions through transportation, which has so much focus in decarbonization world. When we talk to corporate sustainability people, it's whether it's the actual fuel consumers, the end use markets of, railroads or airlines or marine, right? Yeah. But it's also then the people that participate in that, because the folks that don't do much, the white collar kind of soft services world, they look at their corporate emissions and they're like, well, all of our emissions have to do with people traveling or our goods traveling. And so to me, it's really cool to be able to kind of potentially marry up those things together. Right.
Well, I agree. I think that the biofuels market is a market that there's already some I don't know if infrastructure is the right word, but a mechanism, if you will, for quantifying and recognizing through the market the CI score of the feedstocks.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of setting a precedent, if you will, for something that I believe is bound to come, across all the demand sectors, whether it's food, fiber, fuel, whatever. We certainly hear about CPGs, looking, downstream for, the carbon footprint of their food ingredients. But I think that the biofuels market has an opportunity to really send a signal to the producers to think about what they're doing from a climate smart perspective. And the applicable practices for producers may vary that benefit their production systems, if you will. And, so for the climate smart practices that may be best for producers in the Dakotas may be very different from those in the Mississippi Delta, the Southeast, or, in the Corn Belt.
And I can even understand that.
Yeah. Or in the Midwest. And so it is recognizing that there's those differences, but yet whatever practices best fit those systems, those producers should be recognized for what they are doing. And when I say recognized, I mean, they will see the benefit in their fields, but they also should be rewarded through the market system also. And so I think that this is an opportunity for that.
This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
All right, I'm Veronica Bradley, Environmental Science Director with Clean Fuels, and we're here today with Sharon Bard of Terra Economics talking climate smart agriculture in biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel production and biofuel programs. So we talked a little bit about USDA's request for information, RFI, and I know you and I spent a lot of time. You spent more time than me, but we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we give USDA something to run with so that we can start now. And, as science evolves, as practices evolve, as the information evolves, improve and expand. And as you were saying, further incentivize and reward those beneficial practices. So what did we do?
Well, I think, we really kind of stepped back and looked, from the 30,000 foot level. And I think that one of, to start with, and I think that one of the things that we did is we identified, the carbon offset market is something that has been really ratcheting up over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think that we observed some of the challenges that market has had. And in doing that, you and I have spent a lot of time in terms of conversations with people, reading research
you found
papers,
all the good people,
and understanding what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. I think that's one of the things that we did to kind of set the stage for the endeavor that we started or embarked on in terms of what suggestions could we provide to USDA. And one of the things that we really recognized was a lot of the challenges with what we call quantification of the outcomes. And really that means is either direct measurement of, nitrous oxide emissions from fields, which I
still don't even understand how that works.
Well, it's very cumbersome. It takes a lot of equipment and it's very expensive to do.
Right.
And then there's also, measuring carbon in soils. And to do that, it takes soil sampling and it's very expensive to do the soil.
And it seems it's
sampling.
it's also kind of like an art too. Cause I feel like
Yes,
we've had
it is.
conversations about, well, how deep do you measure
Yes,
the soil
there is.
carbon?
And there's different ways to measure the carbon in the soil. And so, there's different methodologies for that. So, so that's direct measurement is kind of one way that you can measure these outcomes. So what has evolved over time is these complex these complex models. But with them there's a lot of uncertainty and differences in the information that goes into the models, which then creates differences in what comes out of the models. So with understanding that, really what we want to see is that producers are rewarded for the practices that they're implementing.
Yeah. And knowing that like these are good practices, right?
Exactly. And there is enough research out there that we know that X practices such as cover crops or no-till or nutrient management or soil amendments, I mean, they do generate beneficial outcomes, either reduced emissions or increased soil carbon sequestration.
Yeah, which I think, we're thinking about what the environmental outcome is of that pillar of greenhouse gas emissions, but it seems like these practices have proof that they kind of address other pillars, right? That you talked about, like especially that resiliency. And I remember last year being at a ranch in Texas where this woman showed us kind of like the way that we do our practices, when you add our soil and you add water to it and it's like crystal clear water and this beautiful thing. And she's like, yes. And if you don't do this, here's this mucky stuff that just becomes runoff that's horrible for everything downstream.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I happen to live on a farm that's, that the drainage systems ultimately feeds into the Mississippi River Basin. And, one of the things that has been a big issue is decreasing nutrient runoff.
Yeah.
And so these climate smart practices ultimately also decrease, the nutrient runoff. And
which you said emissions, because I think like the nutrient runoff also ties back to those emissions, right? Because the nutrient runoff is part of that kind of calculation and that quantification of emissions that are greenhouse gas emissions, but go beyond just greenhouse gas emissions to water quality issues.
Right. And so that's just one of the elements, if you will, of kind of the entire carbon footprint of producing the field of soybeans. So so what we were looking for is something that basically was practice based. And so getting back to the quantification challenges. So we recognize that there are many brilliant scientists out there that are working on these challenges, both not only in the U.S. but globally. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing that they're still doing this research, there's also a lot of gaps at this time. And so we felt that what really needs to be done is something that can be rolled out quickly. Yeah. And so we thought
lack of data is like the sustainability person, where no matter what capacity you work in, sustainability is like the end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's
not be all of like, we'd love to know more, but we need the data.
Exactly. And there's not one researcher or governmental agency that would not acknowledge, they would all acknowledge that data is one of the largest problems, data availability. But, recognizing that, we kind of focused on what is implementable, scalable, and reasonable to roll out in the short term. And so we looked at a practice-based system that is looking at a set of 9 practices that while those 9 practices may not be applicable to all farmers across all regions in the country, but from that menu, they could pick at least, a few of them that could give them some type of carbon intensity score that they could then provide to their
credit
customer.
The score, right?
Correct. Credit their score.
And I think, and regional, knowing that kind of those wonderful resource attributes of the country, right, are variable, and knowing that kind of those greenhouse gas emission changes are going to depend on those factors of climate and soil and the ecosystem that you mentioned before. So how do you kind of properly incentivize at a regional level when you have that much disparity? I mean, I think we looked at kind of
4 or 5, I think it was 4 different region classifications. And we settled on the USDA's farm resource regions. Mm-hmm. And those are defined by topography, cropping systems, and the reason, and among other factors. And the reason why we went with that system, in part, in addition to their recognition of the different topography and climates, it was also just from a practical perspective, is that they were also delineated by county lines. And so, some of the other regions were not specific to county.
So it simplifies validation of the method.
Yes, it does. And it also simplifies that if USDA were to eventually evolve to something that may be either at a crop reporting district, which is multiple counties within a state, or even at the county level, a grower in a county wouldn't have to figure out which major land resource region they're in.
Right,
they just know which county they're in. And so anyway, so that's what motivated us to decide on the USDA's farm resource region.
And so then you mentioned how we want to make sure that like the best practices in each region are being rewarded. So how do you kind of get that? Because I know after the rollout of the climateless quote pilot program for climate smart agriculture with the SAF blenders tax credit 40B, that they were like, national approach, you got to do these couple of practices, you have to do both of the practices. And there was a lot of feedback of, well, cover cropping for soybean, right? It was cover cropping and no-till, and cover cropping eliminates all sorts of regions for a variety of reasons. So how do you make sure?
Or no-till might not be the appropriate tillage. I mean, it might be strip till or reduced tillage. And so I think that, what we decided, what we ended up recommending is a scoring system that would reward producers within each region equitably, recognizing that the outcomes in one region would not be exactly the same as another region because of the things that we've already talked about, differences in climate and cropping systems and topography, soil types. But from a relative basis, we wanted to make sure that a producer that is doing everything he can in one region is rewarded equitably or the same as a producer that is doing everything he or she could do in another region. Yeah. And so that's what we recommended, is more of a standardized credit system, that's based on each region. Yeah. But that yet giving each producer the selection of which practices are most appropriate for his or her farming operation.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I love about this, because I'm, this nerdy emissions, also nerdy lawyer, right, is like this marrying of where carbon intensity methodology and life cycle assessment methodology kind of meets what that framework really has, which is decision makers deciding how you're going to compare things, right? And I think that this is like a great use of that option for a policymaker who's thinking about, well, what I'm trying to do is incentivize this practice. Yeah, right. So how do I do that? And it gives, life cycle assessment framework under, international standards, gives that decision maker, that policy maker, the opportunity to really make those choices that are informed by science.
Right.
But I think the other piece that we talked about that I think reinforces that kind of policy perspective is going beyond just the environmental outcomes. So what other considerations are there?
Well, I mean, I think that if you look at, kind of what they call the 3 pillars of sustainability, which is somewhat embedded in kind of what I described earlier in terms of the pillars for climate smart ag, is, besides the environmental outcomes, there's also the social and the economic outcomes. And
a triple bottom line.
Yes. And I'm married to a farmer, so I hear the economic part of it, a lot. Yeah. And if it doesn't make sense economically, it's very difficult for a farmer to justify, the additional expense of something if he or she's
it's like a business.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It is a business.
Anybody working in corporate America can translate that, right?
And, given the fact that soybeans is a commodity, unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, it's just the nature of the beast that producers are typically price takers.
Right.
And so as a result of that, economics really it cannot be ignored in terms of, what role it plays. And when I say plays in terms of the adoption and ongoing implementation of climate smart practices. And when I say economics, I'm talking about both the operating costs, in addition to the capital required. And operating costs may be, for example, with cover crops, you've got the cost of the seed, and then also the cost of the application of the seed.
Well, and if you normally have like fallow land, it's also like all the extra labor that has to go into it, right?
Right. Yeah. And then also, if you're looking at a different type of tillage system, whatever implements are required, and machinery is very, very expensive these days. And if a producer has invested a lot of money in one type of implement, and then, oh, well, I'm going to do no-till or reduced till or strip till now. We're looking at thousands and thousands of dollars of new equipment. But then also there's the social aspect. And when I say social in this respect, I'm talking about the barriers to adoption. What is preventing a producer from adopting these practices? And it may be economics, but it also may be within the fact that the cropping system in the area where he or she farms is not applicable. It's not that those practices are not applicable, or it is. Really, like many other businesses, farming, there's a culture, but that culture varies by region too. And so there's that. There's also the perception of risk, and risk is another component also of economics, but there's also the perception of risk too. Right.
Or perceived ROI, right? Like return on investment.
Right. Yeah. And then there's also the challenge of learning new practices. Cover crops, it's not as simple as one would think in terms of starting that practice.
You can go to my garden and I know that it's not that simple to plant new plants.
It's not.
For some reason, they don't just grow without water or love.
Right. And it's a matter of knowing what is the appropriate species of cover crop are to plant, when to get it on, and because often farmers are very busy at harvest time. Right. And often cover crops need to be planted either right at harvest or right after harvest. And how do you manage that labor? And so, that's another challenge. And so in addition to the environmental aspects, one really needs to be cognizant of the social and the economic aspects.
Yeah, and so we really recommended to kind of take those considerations and rate the practices in different regions to be able to kind of, again, create that score that turns into a credit based on all of these other factors so that we can actually incentivize properly that change.
Yeah. And so, that's what we are hoping that they would consider in the short run. And then in the long run, we're hoping that, they continue emphasizing, the biogeochemical modeling, which is the complex models. And then in addition to collecting, soil data, emissions data through their funded research and
those climate smart commodity grants.
Right. And then also whatever DOE is continuing to fund through the RPE program. So there's many opportunities to continue to collect that information. And then it's making sure that data becomes available to those that need that information to then further develop the models, because that is, at this time, those models are probably the most scalable way to quantify the emissions. Sure. And so, that is the ideal goal of the effort. But I don't think that there's enough confidence at this time that they can really be scalable and accurate at the level that we feel they need to be.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think I'm really excited about what we proposed. Obviously, I geeked out on it. I was like, we might actually be able to do something. I say that like we don't do things, but do something new and make a change.
Oh, I agree. I agree. If anything, it is kind of thinking outside the box. Yeah. And I think that instead of kind of going down the same avenue, we have said, well, what could be done differently that really can make a difference and be something that is, I hate to keep using the same word, implementable, but, if that's really such a word, but, that can be,
but it needs to be practical to be used, right? Yes. Nobody's going to do something impractical, right? Yeah.
And be, put into action pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, not only for chatting with me, but for all of the hard work that you and the folks that you've talked to have put into making this possible.
It was a team effort, and, thanks to you for leading that effort. That you've done a wonderful job, and it's just been a joy working on this. And I don't anticipate this being the end of the topic or the conversation, and so I just hope that, we have many more in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right. Great information. And that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode. If you enjoy the show and you've got a moment and can give us a rating, we do appreciate it. It helps us get higher up on the lists. And if you really want to go for it, just leave us a review. You never know, we might just read it here. So please do that wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have a question for our experts or a suggestion for a future topic or guest, you can email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. Better, Cleaner, Now is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. Follow us at cleanfuels.org and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Clean Fuels Alliance America, visit us at cleanfuels.org.